There's a particular kind of exhaustion that does not come from working too hard. It comes from pretending too long, from the performance of being fine when you are not fine, from waking up in the morning and feeling the weight of everything you were supposed to be, capable, composed, unbothered, and knowing somewhere in the quieter part of yourself that the distance between who you are and who the world requires you to be has grown so wide that you are no longer sure which side of that gap is really you. It is not depression, exactly. It is not burnout, exactly. It is something more specific than that and harder to name. It is the feeling of being slightly estranged from your own life, like you are watching yourself go through the motions of living while the deeper part of you sits somewhere further back, waiting to be asked a question that nobody ever asks. You carry this feeling through meetings and meals and conversations where you say the right things. You carry it into sleep and back out of sleep. You carry it through weekends that are supposed to restore you but somehow don't. And the strangest part is that nothing is catastrophically wrong. Your life, measured from the outside, may look entirely acceptable, which makes the feeling harder to justify and easier to dismiss. And so you dismiss it, again and again, until the dismissal itself becomes a kind of weight. This is not a modern problem, even though it wears modern clothes. And the reason this channel, the Stoic Path, was built, the reason these words are being spoken to you right now, is because 2,000 years ago a man sat alone in the hours before dawn and wrote about this feeling with more precision and more honesty than almost anything written since. He wrote about it not because he was a philosopher performing philosophy, but because he was a man who was drowning in obligation, surrounded by sycophants responsible for the lives of 60 million people, and profoundly quietly, persistently lonely in a way that power only deepens. He wrote in a private journal that was never meant to be read. And in that journal, he left something behind that is not ancient wisdom in the distant marble statue sense. It is more like a letter from someone who understood. Someone who lived inside the same gap between performance and self that you are living inside right now. His name was Marcus Aurelius. And before you decide, you already know who he is. Before the name conjures the image of a Stoic emperor who has been quoted on motivational posters and LinkedIn posts so many times that the quotes have lost their original weight. Stay with what is being said for a moment, because there is something about the actual life of this man, not his philosophy but his life, his specific human circumstances that almost nobody talks about. And it is that specific life, that specific suffering, that makes what he found inside himself matter in a way that pure philosophy cannot. Marcus Aurelius was born in the year 121 in Rome, into a family of wealth and status, but not imperial power. His father died when Marcus was 3 years old. 3 years old. Before memory becomes reliable, before a child can hold a face clearly in their mind, he was already acquainted with absence. He was raised by his grandfather, and then by his mother, Domitia Lucilla, a woman described by those who knew her as unusually intelligent and unusually principled in a city where neither quality was common in women of her class. She shaped him early. The seriousness in him, the refusal to perform, the discomfort with flattery, these qualities appear very early in the historical record, and they bear her fingerprints. He was educated brilliantly, obsessively, by a series of tutors who recognized in him something rare. He began studying philosophy seriously at the age of 12, which in that era was not eccentric, but was still unusual in its intensity. And then, when he was 17, his life changed in a way he did not ask for and could not refuse. The Emperor Hadrian, who had no natural heir, looked across the landscape of Roman nobility and selected a man named Antoninus Pius as his successor. But with a condition: Antoninus would adopt 2 young men, who would themselves become the next emperors. One of those young men was Marcus. He was 17 years old when the trajectory of his entire life was redirected by the decision of a dying old man who had noticed his character. He did not want it. This is documented. This is not interpretive. In the letters that survive from his correspondence with his beloved teacher Fronto, there is a quality of reluctance, of wistfulness, of a man who understands what has been given to him, but also understands with painful clarity what has been taken away. He had wanted to be a philosopher, not a philosopher king in the Platonic ideal sense, but a philosopher in the actual, quiet, contemplative, private sense. A man who read and thought and wrote and discussed ideas with people who cared about ideas. Instead, he became the heir to the most powerful empire in the known world, and with that came something that would define the rest of his life, and the philosophy he quietly developed in the margins of it, the absolute impossibility of solitude. Think about what it means to never be alone, not for an afternoon, not for a morning. Every moment of every day surrounded by people who want something from you, need something from you, are performing something for you, are angling for something through you. Courtiers and senators and generals and petitioners and slaves and soldiers. A permanent audience. A permanent stage. And somewhere inside all of that, a man who had wanted nothing more than the silence of a library and the company of genuine thought. He became emperor in 161, at the age of 40, upon the death of his adopted father Antoninus. He immediately did something almost unprecedented in Roman history. He insisted on sharing power with his adopted brother, Lucius Verus, despite having no legal or social obligation to do so. His entire reign was defined by that quality, the refusal to take more than he believed was just, even when taking more was both possible and expected. What followed was 19 years as emperor, and they were not easy years. Within months of taking power, the Parthian Empire attacked Rome's eastern borders and a war began that would last years. Then, when the Roman legions returned from the east, they brought with them a plague, now known as the Antonine Plague, that swept through the empire and may have killed 5 million people. 5 million. Marcus managed this catastrophe in real time with the bureaucratic tools of the 2nd century, while simultaneously managing political instability, military threats on the northern frontier from Germanic tribes, and the daily administrative weight of governing the ancient world's largest empire. His co-emperor Lucius Verus died in 169, possibly from the plague. His wife Faustina, with whom he had a complex and apparently genuine relationship, died in 175. He lost several of his children in infancy. He fought a war on the Danube frontier for most of his final decade, living in military camps in the cold north, far from Rome, far from anything that could have been called comfort. And through all of it, through the plague and the wars and the grief and the impossible administrative weight, he kept a private journal, not for publication, not for publication, not for posterity, not to instruct or to inspire. The journal that we now call the Meditations was, as near as historians can determine, a set of private notes Marcus wrote to himself. The word he uses at the beginning of the text is something closer to himself. It is addressed inward. This is a man talking to himself, reminding himself of things he already knew but kept forgetting under the pressure of living, reminding himself not to be corrupted by power, not to be flattered into softness, not to forget that the senators who flattered him today had spoken of him with contempt before his power was assured, not to mistake the performance of philosophy for its practice, not to lose, inside the noise of empire, the quieter voice that had always known what actually mattered. What he found, what he kept returning to in those private pages, is the thing we need to understand, not because it is ancient wisdom, not because it is academically interesting, but because it is the answer to the specific feeling described at the beginning of this, the feeling of estrangement from your own life, the exhaustion of performance, the weight of the gap between who you are inside and who the world needs you to be outside. The concept Marcus returns to again and again with different phrasings and different angles is this, that within each person there exists what he called the hegemonikon, the governing faculty, the inner citadel, the seat of reason and judgment that cannot be touched by anything that happens outside it unless you allow it to be touched. That everything external, everything, absolutely everything, is, in his language, indifferent, not unimportant, not irrelevant, but indifferent in a very specific technical sense, beyond the reach of your genuine self, unable to determine your character, unable to define your worth, unable to destroy your peace unless you hand it that power. And the thing Marcus was most concerned with was not the dramatic external catastrophes, the plagues and the wars, but the interior ones. The moments when a person hands their peace away voluntarily, when someone insults you and you spend 3 days replaying the insult, when someone ignores your work and you spend a week questioning your worth, when the future arrives as an anxiety in your chest at 2 in the morning and you negotiate with it for hours, trying to worry it into submission. These interior catastrophes, Marcus believed, were the ones that actually destroyed a life, not because they were more dangerous than plagues, but because they were self-inflicted, because they were doing it to yourself. Here's what makes this striking, and what makes it more than philosophy. In 1955, a young psychologist named Albert Ellis was working with patients in New York City and arrived, through clinical observation, at essentially the same conclusion. He called his framework rational emotive behavior therapy. The core insight was this: it is not events that disturb people, but the interpretations they place on events. The belief system through which a person processes experience, not the experience itself, is the source of suffering. Ellis had never spent significant time with the Stoics. He arrived there through clinical observation of actual human suffering. Then he read the Stoics and found, to his evident surprise, that they had built this framework with precision 2,000 years before he had. The cognitive behavioral tradition that now underpins most of the world's evidence-based psychological therapies is structurally Stoic. The idea that you can identify a thought, examine it, question its accuracy, and choose a different interpretation. This is CBT. This is also Marcus Aurelius talking to himself in a military camp on the Danube in the year 7722. The conversation is continuous. The discovery has been made twice, by people who did not know they were following each other. And when a discovery is made twice, independently, across 2 millennia, it is not culture. It is not philosophy. It is something closer to a fact about how the human mind works. Now bring this back to your life. Not abstract life. Your specific, actual, current life. Think about the last time someone at work said something that stayed with you longer than it deserved to. Not a genuine criticism that you needed to hear. The other kind, the offhand dismissal, the subtle undermining, the credit quietly taken, the contribution quietly ignored. You know the specific incident. You can probably feel it right now, a small tightening, a slight heat. You carried that thing home. You carried it through dinner and into the evening. You carried it into sleep, and it was the first thing waiting for you when you woke up. And the whole time you were carrying it, you were also annoyed at yourself for carrying it, because you knew, intellectually, that it was too small to deserve that kind of weight, which added the self-criticism on top of the original wound. 2 layers of pain, from one stupid moment that probably lasted 30 seconds. Marcus would have recognized this immediately. He wrote about it directly. He asks himself, and the question is almost impatient, as if he is frustrated with his own repetitive weakness, why he allows someone else's poor character to become his interior weather, why he lets the quality of another person's soul determine the quality of his own mind. He does not say this to be harsh. He says it because he knows from lived experience that there is another option, that the interior citadel, the hegemonicon, the governing faculty, is not automatically invaded. It is invaded by consent, usually unconscious consent, usually automatic consent, but consent nonetheless. The Stoic insight is not that the insult doesn't hurt. It is that the hurt is separate from the injury, that you can feel the sting of it, acknowledge it, set it down, and continue. The person who hurt you does not have to live inside your head for 3 days. You can decline to host them there. This is not suppression. This is not pretending the thing didn't happen. It is more like what skilled emergency physicians do when they arrive at a scene. They see clearly, they assess accurately, they do not look away, and they do not catastrophize. They remain functional in the presence of difficulty because they have practiced remaining functional. The practice is the thing. And this is where Marcus is profoundly practical in a way that surprises people who come to him expecting abstract philosophy. He is constantly asking himself not just what to think, but how to practice thinking it. He talks about what we would today call cognitive rehearsal, the deliberate preparation for difficulty before it arrives. He talks about voluntary discomfort as a way of reducing the power discomfort has over you. He talks about the morning review and the evening review, pausing at the beginning and end of each day to deliberately orient yourself, to remind yourself what you actually believe before the noise of the world floods in and substitutes its values for yours. If you have found yourself pausing during this, if something said here has landed in you as something more than information, that feeling is exactly why the Stoic path exists. Subscribing means this conversation continues for you. A new video arrives and finds you wherever you are, and the thinking goes on. Now return to the practices, because this is where things become concrete. There is a phenomenon in modern neuroscience called the default mode network. It is a set of brain regions that becomes active when you are not focused on a task, when your mind is wandering, when you are daydreaming, when you are ruminating. The default mode network, when it activates in most people, defaults to one of three things: replaying the past to assign blame or regret, simulating the future to generate anxiety, or constructing a narrative about the self that is usually more negative than accurate. This is what your brain does when you leave it alone. This is what the mind automatically produces when it is not given direction. Marcus Aurelius understood this not in neurological terms, but in precise experiential terms. He understood that the ungoverned mind gravitates towards suffering, that the default is not peace, the default is noise, and that what he called philosophy, what we might call practice, was the active, deliberate, daily work of giving the mind a better direction, not suppressing the noise, not pretending it isn't there, giving the mind something true to orient toward, so that when it wanders, it has somewhere to return. The practice that emerges from Marcus's own pages is this. Every morning, before the day's obligations begin, before the phone, before the news, before any external demand is placed on your attention, you sit for 5 minutes, just 5. And you write one sentence. One honest sentence about what you actually believe matters today. Not what your schedule says matters. Not what your obligations say matters. What you, the actual person inside the performance, believe matters. It can be as simple as, today I want to notice when I am reacting and pause before I do. Or today, I want to treat the person I find most difficult as a test of my own character, not theirs. Or today I will not allow my peace to depend on whether anyone acknowledges what I've done. One sentence. Honest. Specific. Yours. What this does, neurologically, is activate what researchers call implementation intention, a form of mental planning that measurably increases the likelihood that a behavior will actually occur when the anticipated situation arises. When you have explicitly named, in advance, what you intend to do in a specific type of moment, your brain processes that moment differently when it arrives. The unconscious rehearsal has already begun. Instead of reacting automatically from the default mode, from the anxious, ruminating, self-critical baseline, you have given yourself a different default. You have placed a reminder at the entrance to the day. Marcus did this. The meditations read, in large part, like exactly this. A man sitting in the morning and writing sentences to himself about what he intends to remember today. Do not be flattered. Do not mistake the opinion of the crowd for the measure of worth. Do not forget that this day will not come again. Do not let someone else's poor behavior determine your own. These are not philosophical treatises. They are morning sentences. They are a man giving his own mind direction before the empire arrives to take it somewhere else. Now think about the other situation. The one that doesn't involve other people. The one that lives entirely inside you. There is a particular quality of fear that arrives at night. It doesn't always arrive as fear. Sometimes it arrives as planning, as the rehearsal of logistics, as the careful mental inventory of everything that could go wrong in the near and medium future. You lie in bed with what feels like rational thought, but is actually the anxious mind wearing the costume of productivity. You are not solving problems. You are experiencing problems over and over in advance. hoping that enough anticipation will somehow neutralize them when they arrive. It doesn't work. It never works. The rehearsal of catastrophe does not protect you from catastrophe. It only moves the experience of catastrophe forward in time into the nights when you should be sleeping. Marcus Aurelius knew this fear. He was managing an empire during a plague while fighting the war on the northern frontier, while grieving the deaths of his children, while writing letters to his old teacher Fronto about his health, his worries, his exhaustion. He was not immune to the fear. He did not pretend the fear wasn't there. What he practiced, what he returned to constantly in the meditations, was what he called the discipline of assent, the practice of refusing to give full mental weights to an impression before examining it. An impression arrives, the business will fail, the relationship will end, I will lose what I have built. And the untrained mind immediately assents to the impression, accepts it as reality, begins responding to it as if it has already happened. The trained mind pauses. The trained mind asks, is this actually happening? Or is this the mind producing a catastrophe that exists only in itself? This is not denial. This is not toxic positivity. This is what CBT therapists call cognitive diffusion. The practice of noticing that a thought is a thought, not a fact, that the sentence, everything will collapse, is a sentence in your mind, not a report from reality. That the fear at 2 in the morning is a real feeling, but not a reliable forecast. That you can hold the fear gently, examine it honestly, and still choose not to accept it as the final word about your future. There is a passage in the Meditations, and this is one of those moments where the private quality of the writing makes it almost unbearable to read, where Marcus is clearly writing in a period of acute difficulty. He does not specify what it is. He never specifies. He kept the journal private and did not explain his references, but the tone is unmistakable. A man who is deeply tired, who is not sure how much more he can absorb, who is sitting in a military tent at some unreasonable hour and asking himself again why he continues to find this hard when he has thought about it so much. And his answer to himself is not inspiration. It is not a rallying cry. It is something much quieter. He reminds himself that the difficulty is not a sign that something has gone wrong. That difficulty is simply the texture of a full life. That a life without difficulty would not be a life but an absence of living. And that the only thing that changes whether difficulty destroys you or deepens you is whether you consent to it doing the former. The deepening is the option that almost nobody talks about because it is not comforting in the way we want comfort to be. We want comfort to mean the removal of difficulty. What Marcus is describing is comfort as the acceptance of difficulty, not passive acceptance, not defeated acceptance, but the active, clear-eyed recognition that the thing is hard, that it is supposed to be hard, and that the hardness is not a message about your inadequacy, but simply the nature of the work. Think about grief, not the grief of recent loss that is still raw and immediate. That requires a different conversation and a different kind of patience. Think about the grief that is settled in over time, that has become part of the architecture of your daily life. The loss that you have adapted to mostly, but that surfaces unexpectedly, in a smell, a song, a type of afternoon light. A moment when you reach to share something with someone who is no longer there to receive it. That grief, the kind that is not dramatic, not consuming, just present, a permanent small weight. Marcus lost his father at 3. He lost his co-emperor and adopted brother. He lost his wife. He lost multiple children. He lost his teacher, Fronto, eventually. He was surrounded by loss throughout his life, and he was simultaneously surrounded by an empire that needed him to function, to decide, to lead, to appear composed in all things. He had no private life in which to grieve. Everything was public. And yet the meditations are saturated with grief. Quiet, controlled, honest grief from a man who was working through the specific problem of how to carry love for people who are no longer present, without allowing the absence to consume the present. His answer, which has been confirmed by contemporary grief research in ways that would have surprised no one who had read him carefully, is this: the people you have loved do not cease to be real because they are gone. Their influence on you, the ways they shaped you, the moments of genuine contact you had with them, These are not erased by death or departure. They are carried forward in the person you have become. To grieve someone fully is not to move past them, but to integrate them, to recognize that they have become part of the structure of who you are, and that the love you felt is not wasted simply because the object of it is no longer physically present. This is not consolation prize thinking. This is not telling yourself that the loss is okay. The loss is not okay. Loss is loss. But there is a difference between a grief that amputates and a grief that deepens. A grief that cuts away a piece of your capacity to be alive, versus a grief that adds a layer of seriousness to your experience of being alive. A seriousness that is not heaviness, but something closer to weight in the architectural sense. Something that anchors you in the reality of what matters. Marcus would say, and does say in various phrasings throughout the meditations, that the people we have loved are given back to us every time we choose to live according to what they taught us. That the real memorial to someone is not a gravestone, but a change in behavior. That if someone made you more honest, more patient, more willing to see clearly, then they are alive in you every time you are honest and patient and seeing clearly. And that the grief, when understood this way, becomes not a wound but a compass. Now there is something about Marcus Aurelius that the motivational industry has quietly omitted because it complicates the clean narrative of the wise emperor serenely in control of himself and his realm. He failed, often, by his own account, regularly, persistently, and with full awareness. The meditations contain passage after passage where Marcus is reprimanding himself, where he is noting that he did the very thing he told himself not to do, that he was flattered again, that he was irritated again, that he said more than he should have, that he spent time in the company of people who pulled him down and then felt the pull, that he forgot, in the heat of a day, what he had reminded himself of that morning. He was not the Stoic in the sense of being emotionally impenetrable. He was a human being who had a philosophy of how to live, who practiced that philosophy, who fell short of it constantly, and who got up and practiced again. This matters enormously, because the version of Stoicism that circulates online, the steely, unmoved, impervious version, is not what Marcus describes from the inside. From the inside, it looks like a man who is tired and flawed and aware of his own inconsistency, who keeps choosing to return to his values, not because he has transcended weakness, but because he has decided that returning to values after weakness is itself the practice. The practice is not the achievement of a permanent state. The practice is the act of returning, again and again, after every failure, after every deviation, after every morning where you did not feel like being who you said you wanted to be. Returning. There is a reason this resonates with something true in you, not because it is inspiring, but because it is accurate. You have had the experience of knowing what you believe and acting against it, of being the person you are trying not to be in the middle of a conversation, watching yourself do it, helpless or nearly helpless in the moment, and carrying the recognition of it afterward with something between shame and exhaustion. Marcus had this experience constantly, and he had it while being responsible for 60 million lives, which means he had it at a scale that makes most of our failures feel manageable by comparison. And he kept going, not because he was exceptional, because returning is available to everyone. The floor is always there. The practice is always available to be resumed. The concept that makes the returning possible, that makes it something other than masochistic repetition, is what the Stoics called progress. Not perfection, not arrival. Progress. The Greek word is prokoptono, which translates roughly as one who is making progress, and it was used by the Stoics specifically to describe the philosopher in practice, the person who is not a sage, who has not achieved wisdom, but who is moving toward it through daily practice, daily failure, and daily resumption. This was considered not a lesser category than sagehood, but the only honest category, the sage. The person who had fully internalized the philosophy and never failed was considered a theoretical ideal by most Stoic thinkers, including Marcus. Real human life was prokoptonon. Real human life was the person getting up again. What does it mean for you? right now, to be a Procoptoan, not to have achieved anything, not to have solved the anxiety or resolved the grief or permanently repaired the relationship or fully absorbed the humiliation at work, just to be in motion, just to be the person who reads this, who thinks about it, who writes one sentence tomorrow morning, who notices when they are handing their piece to someone else, and occasionally, not always, just occasionally, declines to do so. That is all of it. That is the entire practice. Marcus Aurelius, at the height of his power in the privacy of his journal, was describing exactly that. A person trying, failing, returning, and trying again, and finding in that repetition, not defeat, but the actual shape of a good life. There is one more dimension of Marcus's thinking that deserves careful attention because it is the most misunderstood and the one that most directly addresses the feeling with which this began. The feeling of performing, of being slightly estranged from yourself, of being what the world requires rather than what you actually are. Marcus was obsessed with what he called the role we play versus who we are. He used theatrical language deliberately. The Roman world was saturated with theatrical metaphor, and he was aware of it. He understood that he was playing a role emperor, that the role required performances, that the performances were not optional, not trivial. They mattered. They served real purposes. They needed to be performed well. And at the same time, he was certain, with the certainty of a man who had thought about it for decades, that if you fully become your role, if you allow the performance to consume the performer, you have committed a kind of self-destruction that no external enemy could inflict on you. He writes about this with an urgency that feels personal, felt. He is not describing an abstract philosophical concern. He is describing his own specific danger, that the role of emperor, which required him to be certain, decisive, composed, powerful, admired, would eventually hollow out the interior person who had chosen philosophy, who had wanted quiet, who grieved privately, who doubted and questioned and struggled, that the performer would eat the person. And so he kept the journal. He kept the practice. He kept writing to himself, addressing himself by name sometimes, reminding the interior person that the role was something he wore, not something he was. This is your situation, not in the same scale. You are not managing 60 million people, but in the same structure. The version of you that shows up at work, in social situations, in the performances that modern life requires, that version is real, and it matters, and it needs to be played well. But it is not you in the deepest sense. It is a role that serves real functions, and the specific modern danger that Marcus understood from the inside is losing track of the difference, allowing the performance to become so automatic, so constant, so rewarded, that the interior person, the one with actual preferences, actual values, actual pain, actual joy, goes quiet, not disappears, just goes quiet. And then the estrangement sets in. The feeling of watching yourself from a slight distance, of not quite recognizing yourself in your own life. The journal was Marcus's way of refusing that estrangement, of returning daily to the interior voice, of saying, here is what I actually think. Here is what I actually believe. Here is what actually happened inside me today, not what I was required to appear to feel. The practice of honest private writing was, for him, the practice of remaining a person while also being an emperor. You do not need to write a journal in the meditation sense, though if you are inclined to, there is enormous value in it. You need something simpler and more available. 5 minutes in the morning before the performance begins, in which you speak to yourself honestly, in which you acknowledge what you actually feel, what you actually want, what you are actually afraid of, and what you actually believe, in which the interior person is given a moment before being asked to suit up for the day. The neuroscience here is straightforward. Research on what is called self-disclosure. The practice of honestly naming and articulating your internal states shows consistent and significant effects on stress regulation, emotional processing, and psychological well-being. When you put language to an internal experience, you engage the prefrontal cortex in processing that experience, which reduces the activation of the amygdala, the brain's threat response system. In plain language, naming what you feel reduces the charge of what you feel, not by pretending it isn't there, by making it legible, by bringing it from the vague, overwhelming, unnamed territory of inner experience into the specific, manageable territory of language. This is what Marcus was doing. He was not suppressing his feelings by writing about philosophy. He was naming his actual interior states, his irritation, his grief, his weariness, his doubt, and in naming them, reducing their power over him. So here is the single practice, stated with the specificity it deserves. Tomorrow morning, before your phone and before any demand from the outside world reaches you, sit somewhere quiet. It does not have to be comfortable or ceremonial. Set 5 minutes and write. Or if writing is not available to you, speak quietly to yourself. One honest sentence about what you actually feel, followed by one honest sentence about what you actually choose. Not what you feel you should choose. What you, knowing everything you know about yourself in your life right now, actually choose to orient toward today. The sentence about feeling might be, I am carrying a weight from last week's conversation that I haven't set down yet. Or, I'm afraid about something I cannot fully name. Or, I feel more alone than my life looks from the outside. Whatever is true, you are allowed to know what is true. The sentence about choice might be, today I choose to notice one moment when I'm reacting from fear and pause before I act from it. Or, today I choose to let one thing be imperfect without spending energy on hating the imperfection. Or, today I choose to remember that the difficulty is the practice, not the failure of the practice. 2 sentences. 5 minutes. Done. What Marcus Aurelius discovered in the private pages of a journal that was never meant to be read is not a secret hidden in ancient philosophy. It is a description of what is available to you inside your own experience, inside your own capacity for honest self-observation and deliberate choice. The meditations survive not because they are brilliant philosophy, though they are, but because they are honest, because they are the record of a man who was failing, regularly, at being the person he believed he was, and who got up every morning and tried again, who wrote to himself not to perform wisdom, but to find it imperfectly, in the middle of an impossibly demanding life. He died in 180 CE in a military camp on the Danube, while continuing the northern campaign he had been fighting for most of his final years. He died not in Rome, not in comfort, not in the quiet philosophical life he had wanted as a young man. He died in the field, in the cold, still carrying the weight of 60 million people, but by every account that survives, by the accounts of people who despised him politically, who had no incentive to flatter a dead man, he died as he had lived, without self-pity, without cruelty, without pretending the dying was something it wasn't. He died continuing to practice what he had been practicing for 40 years, not because the practice had made him invulnerable, because it had made him honest. And honesty, he had decided, was the only form of peace that was actually available. The journal he left behind, the meditations, the notes to himself, the private record of a man trying to remain a person while governing an empire, was found published without his permission, and has been in continuous circulation for nearly 2,000 years. You are reading it in this form right now. Not because you are studying history, because the feeling described at the beginning of this, the performance, the estrangement, the exhaustion of being required to be something, is the same feeling he was writing against, and what he found, imperfectly, repeatedly, to failure and return, is the same thing available to you. The interior citadel, the governing faculty, the quiet place inside you that is genuinely yours, that the noise of the world cannot enter without your invitation, that exists beneath the performance like the actual ground beneath a stage. It has always been there. He did not invent it. He just learned, slowly and with great difficulty, to return to it, and left the map behind. What is the one thing? Not a philosophy, not a system, just one honest thing that you would write in your morning sentence tomorrow. If you allowed yourself to be as honest as Marcus was when no one was watching,